Our next panel here is going to look like the convening of some ancient Gaelic Oireachtas now. So I'm going to be joined by, wait till I see who's coming up first, by Oisín, by Saoirse, and by Manchán. So thrilled to have all of them. So I suppose, Oisín, when I met you a few weeks ago over a coffee, I had said to you, and it's true for the three of you, that generally the prophet is never welcome in the homeland, but 2019 has been a momentous year where the work that the three of you have been engaged in for a long time now has finally entered a level of mainstream consciousness and mobilisation. Could I ask maybe all three of you, what has this year of 2019 meant to you, and what has it meant for your work? Oisín, do you want to?
I mean, it does really feel momentous. I was very cautious for the first part of the year, because what's the saying? It's not the hope that kills you. It's not the despair that kills you, it's the hope. So we've had a moment like this before, back 12 years ago, when climate change was very much in the news in 2006, 2007. And the recession swept Al Gore's movie, the Stern Report, and another scientific report from the IPCC. And the recession swept all that away. So I was cautious about being too hopeful when I saw the kind of movement building again. But I think something has changed. As I think I was saying to you, one of the things that's changed is that the climate's changed in the last 10 years, so people feel it much more viscerally now. It's not just a story on the news about polar bears or Africa, it's in our own lives. So that I don't think it will be brushed away no matter what happens, a hard Brexit or a Chinese trade war. So I think something has really changed, and of course the biggest thing that happened was the arrival of I don't like calling them the cavalry because it's a military reference, and because it puts too much responsibility on their shoulders, but the young people taking to the streets. So for me, standing on the steps of Buswell's Hotel, where I've done so much lobbying over the years, and seeing 10,000 children fill the streets in March, I knew something had changed.
Saoirse, for yourself, it was also a year of political action.
Yeah.
You burst onto our screens.
And into tears so many times as well. I suppose on a personal level, like really personally, it's been a huge year in that I just I'm getting more comfortable with it, but I in general don't enjoy putting myself out there. Like I hadn't a Facebook at all.
You're not enjoying us.
No, well, this is fine, and panels are fine.
And they're lovely.
Yeah, and they're lovely, but and you're lovely. Everyone's lovely. But putting myself out there, I found really difficult. Yeah. But along with that, what I also found was like this kind of sense of almost like, so every politician I've met since, I've been like, this is it. This is you. For years, I know myself, I had kind of left it to politicians and kind of seen them as something different or something to be deferred to. And not that you're not respectful or whatever, but I feel like almost I've been tricked for years in giving so much authority and so much power.
Agency.
Yeah, to politicians who, a lot of them aren't that impressive at all. But in terms of the climate, like I would totally agree with Oisín in that so much has changed, but it's almost like now we need to step forward. And I think there's also a risk because so often it's so tempting to just be like, oh, everyone's talking about it now, you can step back. But that we keep pushing so that narrative of we want change and we need something different isn't captured by perhaps more negative storylines.
Yeah.
And so while it has been momentous, it feels like it's just the beginning of the next few decades of momentousness.
In a funny way, I have more anxiety now because there's this opportunity, and we have to make the most of it, of this moment before we lose it.
So, like, I always wanted to put myself back into the 1960s to think, how did human consciousness suddenly get this idea that we have a connection to the earth and that we need to respect each other and that we need to go beyond that whole male-female divide? Something happened in the 1960s and I thought I could never experience that. And this year I am finding that. I'm realizing that my thoughts now are entirely different from what they were a year ago. And I can gauge that because, like, for the last 20 years, I've been a travel documentary maker or a travel journalist or a travel writer. And that's what I was going to be until the end of my days. And every January I went away for a month. So last year was to Lebanon, the year before to Cuba, the year before to South America. Always went somewhere. And of course, this January comes along, and in September I'm about to book my flights. And I think, no, I can't do that anymore. That has to end.
Yeah.
And nobody told me that. Somehow the consciousness has changed. And like, I've known Oisín for maybe 15 to 20 years. Oisín was always a marginal voice. You know, the organizations like Friends of the Earth were marginal. Now they're mainstream. Now they're the first person you're hearing on the news. So this is one of those moments that consciousness changes. And nobody can control that. That happened because of people. So, and again, I'm always thinking back my great-granduncle, the O'Reilly. What happened in 1914, 15, 16? That suddenly they decided, I want a bigger thing. I'm not happy. So, yeah, it is frightening and awe-inspiring.
And Oisín, I might ask you maybe to bring us through two aspects of this. We find ourselves here at the point you've all described, and Martha described it with a real sense of time moving on, time running out. Two things. Will you maybe tell us what the science is now saying? You know, we hear about the race to net zero 2030, 2050, the carbon debt that's already incurred. Maybe talk a little bit about that. And we also entitled this The Greening of Ireland. We have reached this point as some of the highest per capita emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. How did we get here, and where are we moving to?
So the science, as briefly as I can, before the Industrial Revolution, before we started burning coal and then gas and peat industrially, there was 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now that's a meaningless figure to everybody until you hear what it is now, and it's now past 407. So we've increased it almost 50% in less than 200 years. And the last time it was that high, it just traps the heat. That's what it is, like a blanket around the Earth. The temperature rises, the ice melts. It's as simple as that, and it disturbs the atmospheric climate system. It's 3 to 5 million years since it's been that high. When that last happened, it was 2 to 3 degrees warmer on average around the world, and sea levels were 10 to 20 meters higher than they are now. So that's the path we've put ourselves on. Already this time, we're at 1 degree above where we were in 1750. The IPCC, the international science body, said we should not go above 1.5 degrees. Anything beyond that is dangerous. Current policies have us going to 2.5 to 4.5. So right back where we were 5 million years ago. And the scientific consensus more or less says 4 degrees is incompatible with the global organized human community, or civilization, as you and I might call it more briefly. So it's an existential threat, like nuclear war or an asteroid hitting us. And that's why Greta Thunberg spoke the truth that others have been afraid to speak. Why aren't you panicking? Why aren't you panicking like your house is on fire? Because it is. And why aren't you acting like that? And getting to 1.5 is staying under 1.5, and we're already over 1 degree. That means globally, according to the IPCC, getting emissions down by half by 2030 in 11 years. That's where that 11-year figure comes from. And to zero, or net zero, so any pollution would be sucked in by trees or bogs, to net zero by 2050. That's globally. And of course, in the rich world, where we've used more than our fair share of the atmosphere until now, we have to go further and faster than that. And that means far more than we have now. It means radical new policies, which we have not yet adopted.
And Ireland?
So when I started this job, which is now almost 15 years ago, I came from the overseas aid sector, and we were the 6th most generous country in the world in overseas aid, and among the rich world, and made a fuss of that. And I did the maths when I arrived in this job and looked, we're the 6th most polluting country in the world for emissions per head of population as well. Now, between the recession and everything else, we're the 8th. We've gone a bit better on carbon and actually a bit worse on aid. But it's still a huge contradiction, and we're still the 3rd highest in the European Union in terms of our carbon footprint per person. So it's obviously it's a disconnect between that and our green image. And I think very briefly, our green image came about because we have this beautiful landscape around us, and for a long time we were the poor man of Europe. So it was right that we actually didn't have a huge carbon or other polluting impact. Then along came the boom, and we didn't want anybody getting in the way of our party, our coming out party, the end of poverty. We didn't want to be told we shouldn't build here or we shouldn't have motorways or whatever. And then there was a brief moment between 2005 and 2007 where we began to talk about elder care and health care and childcare and maybe planet care, and that moment in 2007, moving beyond the kind of bare minimalist, materialistic concerns, and then the crash came. So of course you're back to jobs and debt and house prices, etc. So we didn't get enough of a chance of like enjoying affluence long enough to tidy up after ourselves like other countries have. Now we're coming out of that again, and so between that and the global moment, we have a chance to make amends and to make a difference. But we're just at the starting line. What the government's done recently, driven by the Citizens' Assembly and by a parliamentary committee and by the mass movement of citizens, we're just now at the starting line for the race, in the race against time, the race between tipping points of action on the one hand, or irreversible climate change on the other.
And the key area, like, we're not a heavy industry nation, we're not seeing ourselves melting into the areas for impact in terms of actually making.
Well, the biggest thing...
The drivers of all of it.
The biggest thing is we're still burning coal for electricity. It's the single biggest thing the government could do to bend the curve of emissions. It would mean all those other things we're doing, like heat pumps and electric cars, would be less polluting than they are now. That's why they have to sit down with the trade unions and not wait and make a mess of it like they have at the peak stations, but sit down now with the trade unions and negotiate an orderly and fair exit from coal long before 2025, when it's due to come offline. That would make the biggest difference. And the other things are actually positive things, like when you are helped to do your house, not just with grants or subsidies, but with the information and the support, you get a warmer house with lower fuel bills and healthier air. Oh, and by the way, you reduce emissions. But we need to do that for 2 million homes across the state in the next 10 years or 20 years, another million at least in the next 10 years. So it's a huge undertaking. Transport, we're a very disconnected, we're a very dispersed population, very, very underfunded public transport system. We put 2/3 of our money still into private transport, into roads, and only 1/3 into public transport. That has to change, particularly for investment in rural Ireland in transport. But a lot of those things that we need to do are not sacrifices. They are reordering of our priorities. But yeah, we have a happier, more connected, more warmer homes, better lifestyle, healthier lifestyle when we do it. But it does brush up against vested interests, and there are some really difficult ones like agriculture, of course.
And Saoirse, Deirdre, I suppose, touched on it here in terms of thinking about shorter supply chains. And obviously Ireland has been pursuing a model of intensified agriculture. We've seen the protest this week, not only in Dublin, but in Berlin. You've been thinking about agriculture, tourism, from your vantage point in Mayo. What does a very, very different future look like?
Well, a very different and very possible, I think, because agriculture is in a crisis. So we have about 140,000 farmers, and we have about 90,000 suckler farmers. And suckler farmers, as everyone knows, the majority of them are having quite a hard time at the moment in terms of making any profit. Yeah. And so there's definitely an opportunity to, firstly, I think, erase those lines that have been drawn between communities and farmers and the environment, because they have to be really recent lines. Like, they're never before, I can imagine, was farming and the environment pitted against each other. Like, I've been on radio stations and they are one of the only professions whereby a degraded environment means you have a degraded farm.
Yeah.
But what I would love to see, and I think we can use the Common Agricultural Policy while we have it, because it's an enormous tool, and we have...
It's a framework it offers, if it's appropriately.
But it also means that we can... Now, it's unfortunate that we would have to, but we can financially arrange things differently, because I suppose it has been arranging things a certain way for, 50 years. And it did start out solely as an agricultural production policy. So I think it lacks in a lot of ways that it doesn't have the proper ability to factor in environmental concerns, to factor in human health care, to factor in social equity, because it is just about maximising production. And people are tweaking it a bit, but I think we could use it, because so many of our farms are dependent on subsidies, to reward farmers for, I suppose, results-based biodiversity and carbon actions, but all the while moving towards a much more, moving towards food sovereignty, which, like, I'm reluctant to even use the term globalization because so many people use it now, and then they're talking about chemtrails. But I think we need to, I suppose, turn our agricultural production to looking inwards at Ireland now. And while CAP can help that, what I would love to eventually see is farms supported by communities, and farms responding to communities, and farms responding to and being supported by and supporting the environment, and bringing it back to a time where there was no disconnection between the three. Like, you know, people talk about all the food we produce in Ireland, but we'd get pretty sick of beef and dairy if we weren't importing food. And we import a lot of our...
80% of our food is imported.
Yeah, and 85% of what we produce is exported. And a lot is imported from England, and then even within that, 31% of the land used to produce food for Europe is outside of Europe. And unlike everything else, like, airplanes could keep flying if it was a deserted, barren wasteland, but you couldn't keep farming. And I think it's at the very core of our relationship with the land and how we see it and how we interact with it. Like, it's a bit of an aside, but you hear people who have been to a farm for the first time ever, and it's the first time they've ever seen anything giving birth. And it's just mad to think that we do live so disconnected from our food and from the land. And then I really believe that things like extreme weather events, when we are so disconnected from the land, kind of pass off as meaningless, because you're like, oh, that's just an inconvenience. It's not like, wow, the seasons are changing completely. So getting back to what you were saying, yeah, I think our agriculture does have to change. I'd love to see it producing food. And I think we can do it within CAP as we move towards a really democratized kind of community responsive agriculture.
And Manchán, you've been writing about some of the concrete examples which are on the ground in Ireland today in a working, and again drawing on something Deirdre said, and taking up on Saoirse's theme there about community engagement between producer and consumer. It's a radically different level of closeness than we have lived with for the last 30, 40 years.
Exactly, and while Oisín said there was this great opportunity in 2007, 2008 when the country had wealth, it was also a stop because we were comfortable, we weren't willing to change, things were working. What's great now, so I live in the Midlands, and you know, we're here now in Kerry, or you go to West Cork, places on the edges were the places that change. Philip is always talking about the edge, the potential, the meeting place. Midlands, we do things more slowly. You know, we are not the pioneers. And yet, what I'm seeing in Westmeath is just so much change.
Yeah.
So for example, like I have 10 acres there, and I am now growing, so we now import almost €1 billion worth of fruit, 850 million euros worth of fruit, and veg included in that. But now I'm growing pomegranates, I'm growing pawpaws, I'm growing parsimons, I'm growing apricots, peaches, plums, Japanese, all these rare varieties. None of this we knew about, and none of it was really possible. Well, just we didn't know. So there's a new knowledge coming with us learning about the microbiome in the soil and how to make that soil fertile. Us making farming. Like, I am not a farmer, I'm extremely lazy. I grow all these because it is now so easy with irrigation, with no dig, you know, where you are allowing the soil regenerate and recover. Now, this is information that Targus has had no interest in so far because we've been, you know, focused on beef. But the potentials are there. And what I'm seeing in my local area, you know, where they're on their knees with the prices of beef at the moment, and even the slog of dairy, despite the money there, and knowing that it can't survive. So, like, everything is changing, but the biggest single sign you're seeing is the men's sheds. Like, if we had believed 10 years ago that men would have come together completely voluntarily, and let's gather in a room, let's bring all our tools, and let's do things not for profit, but just to help the community. And suddenly we're realizing we can connect the land with the social welfare of the place. And the next leap is almost, okay, we have all these elderly farmers and elderly people, and we're going to send them to a profit-making nursing home, or we're going to bring that into the community. And something that made a big difference was this: we now have community development officers, in counties. And again, this could have fallen flat on its face. But what it means in Collinstown, where I live, is that we, who have been at each other's backs for 20 years, we couldn't agree on what we were going to do with the hall. Now we all come together, we create a vision, we create a board, we create a manifesto, we decide what we want in the community, and then there is this funding, which is from the EU through government to local government. Local government is still trying to control it, but they have now armed us. They have given us the tools of coming together and deciding what we want, rather than what the county council, the sort of slightly shady county council. And that's what I see is changing. And again, as you say, so I have this column since May on the Irish Times, One Change column. Had this column been in the Irish Times last year, in fact, they've had an eco column for 10 years, no one would have read it. Something has happened. Now the impact of this column, I think about 4 weeks ago I wrote about PV. I'd put in my 14 solar PV panels. So I decided I was going to name 3 installers rather than because there's now a sort of an effect of the double glazing salesman going around and hecking and kind of raising up the prices of PV. So I put in 3 installers.
Threw one of them out of our own kitchen.
Oh, right, very good. Yeah, they sit down.
But I make it as a serious point, actually, and I'm going to come back to Oisín in looking at that mobilisation. If that's our answer to the level of change that you described in terms of retrofit, is dodgy PV companies hoodwinking householders, is an insufficient mobilisation to achieve the level of you're looking at. What I'm saying is, what actually will be our answer to achieve the level of change that we need to do it? So we have the Tipperary Energy Agency at one level working across but as a single entity. Deirdre discussed, the training of community energy mentors. We see Green New Deals mooted now across the world in party politics. It's a level of mobilisation for a period that we've never achieved outside of wartime.
But just to say, the money is there. The 6 billion we're currently spending on diesel, on petrochemicals every year, that's to be had. This is a 6 billion pot. In the same way as that 150 million that we're spending on vegetables and fruit, the money is there. And the plan, like we in Ireland have had a Green Plan Ireland. This Professor David Connolly in Aalborg University, it's always been talked about by people on the edge. He was saying there's 100,000 jobs. Just as Deirdre said, there's 15,000 jobs in this peninsula, converting to sort of air pumps and to sort of sustainable energy heating systems. The technology is there. The money is there too once we stop importing that oil. So it just requires government vision to put things in. Would I be wrong, Oisín? Is that your dream?
I mean, it most certainly needs sustained government leadership, not just a couple of speeches. I mean, it's good to have had a couple of speeches compared to not have them, but we need the sustained leadership. But then it is the really hard work of the kinds of supports and like the bureaucracy, for want of a better word, the systems, the organisations to actually help roll it out on the ground. And that is really hard work, and there aren't even enough staff to do it, and there isn't the mindset to liberate the people to do it themselves in the way that Tipperary Energy Agency does. But like the difficulty of getting that replicated, the bureaucracy of the SAAI, for example, however helpful they can be, it's not at the races in terms of the pace we need. Or the scale we need. I mean, we are talking about change on the scale of the Industrial Revolution, on the time scale of the information revolution, like the time scale of the mobile phone. And that has never been achieved. And it needs the kind of leadership, but at that scale of, say, the moonshot, where the leaders not just say something, but then organise and fund the science and the rollout of the technology. And it's quite a challenging combination. And it's not, we cannot, I mean, as you said, we cannot leave it to our politicians or to our public servants, however well-meaning there aren't enough of them, and they haven't got quite enough of imagination to do it. We need to have their backs, shall we say, whether that's supporting or pushing or both. And not just environmentalists. I mean, you mentioned the Green New Deal. What we're doing now as Friends of the Earth and the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition of usual suspects is reaching out to the trade unions, reaching out to the Children's Rights Alliance, reaching out to the domestic equality and poverty organisations, because it can't be seen as being done to people. It needs to be done with them and by them, and it needs to be done in a way that is not just reducing emissions, but that is reducing inequality and is being seen to reduce inequality and fight discrimination. Or else you get the kind of yellow vest stuff where people feel that they didn't cause this problem and they're being dumped with the effort of the solution. And that's particularly the case when this government in particular tends to reach for a frame of individual responsibility and behaviour change. The Taoiseach famously or notoriously said with their new action plan, which isn't bad, that it was about nudging individuals as opposed to the systems change we need in energy and agriculture, etc. So that frame is alienating people, and I think people reject it. They know it's not correct, and therefore they reject the whole effort. We need a different frame of collective societal transformation, and people need to be liberated and enabled to actually then carry it out themselves.
So Saoirse, you've put yourself up for the job very literally in how does our politics need to change to enable what Oisín just described?
Well, just one point there on what Oisín was saying. I think that's so important that we don't just reproduce old inequalities, because that's just so uninspiring. If we were going to have, a sustainable planet and everything was still so unfair, and there's no reason it has to. And I think the media will be one of the biggest deciders of what happens over the next few years. But so, and I'll probably get given out to for saying this, I actually don't think we need a state structure. I would consider myself an anarchist, but of the school that thinks that as it stands, while we have companies that are so enormous, currently we do need a state to defend us in a lot of ways. And while we're still using such unregulated cash, like capital, people will be left really vulnerable if we were all just to, devolve into these collective kind of societies. So I do think that while we have such a bureaucratic state, what needs to happen is people just need to be braver. Like you see politicians and it feels like it's a career for them and that they just want to get through it. Like I look at one in particular that I know, and I knew he did not want to ever deal with climate change. He just wanted to be a politician. And until, like they do, from what I've seen, chase votes. They will go with whatever the public is saying. And we sometimes, I think, get that backward in that we're like, oh, well, they're saying this, I'll follow them. But in reality, they're just saying what they count up how many votes they'll get by saying a certain thing, and then they say it. And so I think what our politicians decide and the quality of our politicians will come from us. And I do see, having run for election, I was kind of surprised at, maybe not surprised, maybe disheartened at the influence money has in the electoral process. Like it's obviously nothing like the US, but so the spending limit for an MEP candidate is 230 grand. It's like, well, okay, I won't spend any more than that. But you get these, these election specials you get in newspapers and stuff. You have to pay to be in them. You have to advertise with newspapers if you want a press release in it, and it does end up really heavily weighted. And there were 17 people running in my constituency, and I'd say most people could name 6, if even. And also, I think you see a lot of, be it interviews or newspaper columns or interviews, and I understand that the media are under stress, but it's like this moving away from long form. People expect political kind of statements or ideologies to be punchy and build a wall, and they're just not. And especially with climate breakdown, the conversations that we have to have around it are really complicated and I really believe, should get down to the root of what society do we want, not how can we get emissions to zero, but start from what society do we want with zero emissions, and then go from there. But a lot of it is maybe people get fatigued with all the political campaigning. I don't know, but we elect these politicians, and we should be allowed to deselect them as well. But anyway.
Can if you come down to this 11-year period that we're entering into 2030, can democratic societies actually vote for the level of change? If we go back and if 4 degrees of warming is untenable, but 3 is presumably better than 4, and 2 is better than 3, and we're trying to get towards that 1.5, having got 1, like the actual change in how we have lived, constructed these societies, we are the product of an industrial revolution fueled on and we have this generational decision to make, us, not us, the ones doing it now. These 11 years, where are we on the piece between mitigation and adaptation and what democratic societies who are used to growth and a growth mindset and a growth which is without limits? Saoirse Manchán, how can we actually bring this to being?
Can't you ask that?
You have put your finger on why this is the most exciting time to live in, for centuries, really. Because there was a big change, obviously, after the Second World War. But that's because the people of Europe were broken. So leaders could come in and give a new vision. Yeah. And the corporation weren't hadn't control of society. So they were able to come in that. Now we know our leaders aren't, because they're under control of corporations. So the only chance is for us to do it, to stand up. And that's almost Lord of the Rings territory. That's people saying, no one is going to save you. But we know, as Saoirse said, politicians do listen to us. It's the only thing they do listen. Now, we spend most of our time not talking to them and doing what the status quo is. But we think we're inconsequential. We think we're 1 in 7 billion, while the direct opposite is the case. Nothing that we are proud of in this world has been achieved except by single individuals standing up. And it's so simple. It's even now that Lidl and Aldi have those paper and plastic recycles on the other side of the cash register, which is an unimaginable act 2 years ago, that it isn't just a health food shop, but they're doing it. We either are dropping things and filling that basket every time and showing we're not going to take that packaging home. There's a million other examples. And again, I would have been disheartened. I would have said no one was going to step up. But because we're seeing the storms outside, because we're hearing the discomfort of our children who are coming back, as now these green schools, children are coming back with a fear, with a visceral fear, and they are making us act. So the potential is there that, yes, we are going to stand up because we're in desperation, because we've had this last 10 years of recession, the whole of Europe, the whole of the world, and we know we are not spiritually happy anymore. We feel broken. We don't feel in home in our communities. So there's the potentials that we're going to stand up. And the minute we do, politicians will act and then corporations will follow. We think corporations are impregnable. They too are only depending on what we're buying. They need our money. So we have all the power. And then what we need is then the media to lead us. RT Forbes clearly said at the beginning of the year, I'm going to follow government policy. She wasn't going to do anything. November, she's done a tiny bit. But so it requires, I think the Irish Times are a reason, but it's a tiny minority, the Irish Times. So when we get the Irish Independent and RTE following, either leading the public or we're forcing them, then there's every chance. It's a tiny island. It's 4 million people.
Yeah. I think it is worth remembering that Irish politics is actually very responsive, as Manchán said. For years, politicians said to us, but this isn't a doorstep issue. Now, our response used to be, but no, it was banking regulation in 2002 or 2007, but you saw the signs. If you'd acted, people would have been grateful and voted for you. But now we don't need to say that because it's become a doorstep issue. But we need to bring it like one step beyond, and we are looking at models. Can we replicate the Together for Yes style canvassing by civil society to our neighbourhoods to prime them to make it a massive doorstep issue before the next election with a bit more meat in its part of the front, as in not just saying, our advice was just say climate change, make them care about climate change, and then we'll give them the policies. But actually now we need to go a bit further and name the Green New Deal, or name just transition, or name the scale of the transformation to really put politicians' backs against the wall about it. But I think we have the ability in Ireland to do, we've seen it in the 2 referendums. Civil society has the ability to lead social change in Ireland that maybe we didn't think we had, but we certainly do. And the media does play an important role, though. Like even the Irish Times recently had a poll where climate change came out on top, But then they ask this question about public services versus climate action, because trade-off and costs, whereas of course we need investment in public services, except transport, etc., if you reject the government's framing in order to get the action. So, we haven't won the battle of how do we tell the story of climate action yet. And if we can do that, then I think we can bring more. I think the RTE made a big move. I think the Philip Hatcher-Hayes documentary and that week was a big difference. But is it just a week, or is it the new paradigm? That's the question.
Yeah. And like after 11 years, we're not just going to, we couldn't do it, we'll give up now. Like, we'll always, I think, in our lifetimes, be fighting this, and maybe not fighting, but creating something new. I do think every time, like every minute, someone turns 18, and they can vote then. And when I look at them, and I'm like, you're never going to own a house, you might not have a full-time job, you probably never have a pension, but like their priorities are so different. And when you break down polling data by age, it's so stark. There can be 30% difference in different age groups. But I hope our democratic societies can do that. I think they can. I think that it'll be the only way it can happen without us becoming some like vassal state for Facebook or something. And on that, I think Facebook will have to be dealt with, and now hopefully a lot of that regulation will come from the US, because I know they're talking a lot about regulating Facebook. But what I've seen on the doors and talking to friends and family is kind of what I mentioned earlier. The people are so content with like an unnamed source 15-second video clip that are convincing because they're pretty well produced and they're polished. And tackling that will be really important, because people, like you kind of touched on it there earlier, people don't realize that we have all the power. And that not only do we have it, but we're well able for it, and we want it. We've kind of maybe been bought off and lulled into this, sure, everything's fine, and we've no solidarity with people around the world. We have very little, I believe, recognition of what we allow our politicians to do, in how that affects people, because we would never physically we would never say to somebody, you have to make that dress for 50 cents for me. We would never do that. But we do allow companies and corporations to hide and funnel a huge amount of tax through Ireland. And I know we talk about territorial emissions, but talking about global emissions, the effect Ireland can have on whether another country can put in place climate mitigation measures is enormous, because we're allowing global scale theft. And I do think, along with transport and agriculture, if we stopped allowing ourselves be used as a conduit country, we could have an enormous effect around the world. If we stop being complicit in profit shifting, in base erosion of tax takes, then that could really, it would just have an incalculable difference. But like that, it's not a doorstep issue.
So if you look at the Exchequer here in Ireland, and you look at two changes coming down the track, and whether we choose it or whether it comes, but OECD tax level changes are bound to come our way. The other thing that's coming our way is emission fines. Is that going to concentrate mines in a different way over the next decade? What could they become to the Irish Exchequer?
I mean, they could be significant. They could be between 2 to 6 billion over the next decade, which is a chunk of change even by bailouts. It registers even on the bailout scale. But I wouldn't want to bank on them motivating political change or even public change, because we faced heavy fines during the Kyoto period, and then we crashed the economy to avoid them. And it was hard to get...
That's what we did.
Yeah, and I used to joke at the time, and civil servants would laugh too, well, we wouldn't want to do that again in 2020 as the only way to meet our emissions targets. And that's all that would do it for us now. But I think the department officials always feel those fines will never come. I mean, I think they're much more concerned about the OECD tax changes. And I think Saoirse hit the nail on the head. If we maintain a crouched defensive posture about our tax take, as well as our emissions and whether we should be responsible for them, we're not going to solve this. I mean, the Green New Deal style investment is very costly, but the money is there in terms of corporate profits around the world if we had a proper tax system for corporates. But that involves cooperation, and Ireland has been one of the least inclined in Europe, at least, to cooperate on tax. That would really break the logjam. I mean, there was a proposal for a European carbon tax 30 years ago, led by John Fitzgerald, among others, and the government, the Irish government was one of the most people who resisted. If we'd done that, a lot of the problems we have now wouldn't have been there. We need to cooperate at that scale, I think, at that level.
So, 2020, as momentous as it was, 2020, in not much more than 20 seconds from each of you, priorities.
To make the most of the hope that's there now, to try and institutionalize new laws, new movement, not institutionalize movements, but grow the movement to change the balance of forces. We have a real chance now to change the balance of forces. Greta Thunberg has a phrase that she can't originate all of these phrases, but she says, don't look for hope, look for action, because once you act, hope is everywhere. So it's the action you need to see next.
I want to dig a couple of new beds because I've been putting them off for ages, just to expand it so I can have carrots maybe and beetroot all through the winter. I'm going to run for election in Mayo, and so under that guise I'm going to continue badgering everyone about everything from tax to marine protected areas to the environment.
And after these 20 years of encouraging people to take planes, from January on, I'm giving up taking planes for holidays. And what I'm finding is that I was going to give up my travel slots on TV3, on whatever, Virgin Media 1 and RTE 1 and Sean O'Rourke and Dave Fanning and the Irish Times. But I went back to them and said, look, I'm giving up travel. I'm going to take trains across Europe. Will you allow me continue being the travel journalist and trains around Europe? They've all agreed. Wow. So from January on, the next 2 years, I'm going to do at least 10 trips around, and I'm looking forward. I do not see it as a loss, I will, to be fair, I'm going to allow myself every 2 years the equivalent of one flight to LA, which is 2.3 tons of carbon. So whatever that does for work alone, for holidays, for me it's a new opportunity. I'm excited about exploring, even up to Iceland by ferry and train.
A new moral consciousness. Thank you very, very much all. So just also to let you know that Manchán tomorrow, and Martha, who was on earlier, are going to be in the courthouse at about 11:30 at an event called Our Coasts, Our Voices. And there is also a wonderful exhibition and going to be the most beautiful performance at 6 o'clock down in the hub, the Dingle Hub now, this evening, just a few roads down. So if you want to continue with our panellists, they'll be around at that point. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you.